For the student of left-wing psychology that seeks to understand the beliefs of the left, and also not just the beliefs of the left, but the beliefs of the elite left in America, it is very important for us to understand how some of them view the world and the concepts that actually inform how they interact with the world. And Rob Henderson's notion, the social theorist Rob Henderson's notion of luxury beliefs, actually allows us to get a bigger understanding of this very topic. Now, Rob Henderson, just for some of you who don't have any background, he is a social commentator, as I mentioned. He went to the Ivy League. He was this person who was in foster homes his entire life. So his own personal experience informs his formation of his political theory, luxury beliefs. Luxury beliefs basically states, I'm summarizing it, and I'll have links in the description below if you guys want to actually read it. It basically states that there are beliefs that are held by people in the elite upper classes, not because they actually sincerely believe the concept that they are touting, not because they have a conviction in it, but because they seek to distinguish themselves by holding that particular belief. And he calls it luxury beliefs because A, the belief allows the person holding it to distinguish themselves as different and as refined, and B, the belief is oftentimes shared by people of that particular class. Now, to buttress Henderson's theory here, an example of a luxury belief would be the defund the police argument. The argument is that a lot of wealthy left-wing people support defund the police because they live in gated communities where the tangible consequences of that policy actually wouldn't impact them. Therefore, they can hold it. One that I'll add is the minimum wage argument. A lot of wealthy leftists, including Bernie Sanders, may say tax the rich and/or we need to have a living wage, and they'll advocate for what California did recently, raising the minimum wage to $28 an hour, which for them and their insulated bubbles and their financial cushions does not impact them whatsoever. But for the average consumer, it wreaks havoc in hell of cost raising that all businesses must do when they're forced to economize. This is really a restatement of the old provisio, rules for me and not for thee. And so Henderson goes back through history and ties luxury beliefs to originating in how upper classes would address and conduct themselves, whether it be wearing certain clothes to distinguish themselves, or whether it be going to certain events like theaters or recitals, or doing certain things like dueling to distinguish themselves from the hoi polloi, the masses. But he's translated this traditional activity from one of activity and habit towards beliefs. So while I personally think that Rob Henderson's luxury belief theory is actually a very helpful starting point for those of us who want to really understand how leftism works and want to really understand how the sort of elite mind works, for lack of a better term. I do think that it has some limitations that we're going to have to go beyond, and that I'll help you go beyond in this very video. So one of those limitations is the fact that it assumes that someone being a part of a certain income bracket or a certain class automatically has a certain set of beliefs or norms that they practice. This is not the case. Someone having a certain amount of money or being in a certain class simply means they have a certain amount of money or they're in a certain class. Now, of course, it absolutely is the case that there are norms and habits of people that people share who are in certain classes. We can say, for example, that statistically, those who are impoverished tend to be susceptible to certain kinds of crime and certain kinds of habits like drug use or theft. This is a fact. But these are not necessary conditions of being a part of those classes. These are simply things that may, in some cases, come along with people who happen to be in those classes due to other causes that are incidental to their class. So that's the first thing that I think is very important to understand. But perhaps the biggest thing is that Henderson's focus is on the psychology of status and how people do certain things to distinguish themselves. But I want to focus more on the morality and the philosophy of status and what the implications of that are for society in general. On this channel, I speak a lot about the phenomenon of the society of status. In fact, I've gone over it more times than I can really count, and I'll keep doing it because it's really important for us to understand the moral thinking behind a lot of people, that a lot of people in society, especially in American society, don't even understand that they are influenced by. And additionally, it's important for us to understand the ethos of our country, which came out of hundreds of years of history, of Enlightenment discourse surrounding the nature of government, its relationship with man and society, the nature of religion, its relationship with the government and society, and the nature of virtue, its relationship with the reasonable thinking man and society, and how all these things come together to create a prosperous and moral, political, and civil order. And America is the end result of these years, decades, centuries of discourse and discovery. And the most notable thing about America's existence, well, one of the most notable is rather, its rejection of status as a principle. As Henry Sumner May, the great historian, mentioned in the 1800s, for a good majority of human history, human value was calculated as a matter of status, as a matter of what class you belonged to, what familial bloodline you were a part of, what person in authority you were close to, and your entire life, as dictated by the feudal system, which was a egregious example of status, was determined by this singular static force. But America's conception was one rather of contract and one of consent that emphasized the moral agency of the individual, his freedom and his ability to make choices with whom he decides to share his values. And along with this came an entirely different way of seeing the human being, of seeing society, of seeing politics, and also of seeing morality. But status still lingered. And this is where Rob Henderson actually gets it right. Status still lingered. And it still became this rallying point for certain people in society. But it was no longer the basis of morality. It was simply the basis of custom that belonged to certain places in society. But what happened, and this is where I think Henderson's thesis is limited, what happened is around the time the progressive era came along, status and class gained moral intelligibility. What does that mean? That means that status and class became the rallying cry for the proposals of certain kinds of policy that had moral implications. The status and class, for example, of the child and the woman formed the basis of the early child welfare state and the early feminist movements that eventually germinated into the 1950s, 1960s rallying cry that the personal is political, which ultimately created this unending conflict between the sexes, man and women pitted against each other, with the woman believing under this sort of feminist spell that the man was inherently oppressive because the family is patriarchy, therefore politics and society need to be intertwined to deal with the patriarchy. That was one example. Another example was this sort of animosity towards the wealthy. The lie of the so-called Gilded Era, where apparently the wealthy just went roughshod and they managed to exploit the poor people and they did so many bad things, even though the so-called Gilded Era is one of the most monumental periods of innovation and prosperity in American history, and actually decreased poverty and increased the level of progress and prosperity within that era of American history. The progressives came along and said, no, the wealthier got wealthy, they exploited people, which happened in some cases, absolutely, but it wasn't the whole thing. It's reductive to say it's the whole thing. And therefore, we need stronger regulations, antitrust laws, in order to clamp down on the wealthy and make sure that all wealth goes towards the greater good, the common good. This was the leftist conception of class-based policy, seeing the world through a class-based lens. And from this, the welfare state came. From this, the entitlement society came. From this, so many different things that cheapened and harmed the original American dedication to contract by inserting the government into social relations. That was birthed from this, and it brought forth a culture of dependency, of degradation, of decadence, and most importantly, of centralized control, the power of centralized authority over society. And this came from a class-based, status-based worldview. The education system, that is of a great amount of speculation to people in America. The education system was influenced by a certain conception of status that said that education should no longer be about the pupil in and of itself. It should be about advancing social consciousness within the child. This is the theory of John Dewey. And it should secondarily be about educating for the sake of educating. So it went from simply teaching and instructing to injecting society into the classroom and also perpetually talking about and regurgitating certain topics for the sake of regurgitating them to produce more information about those topics and not to actually fulfill the moral betterment of the child and the intellectual betterment of the child. This is the John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson version of education that leftism to this day defends, and they have defended it in many cases under the auspices, now under the New World auspices of DEI and inclusion education. Whenever we've had these cases of these inappropriate books being taught in school, for example, like genderqueer, all these different ideas that elevate gender ideology to this sort of deific status, the defenders of these books have always either said two things. One, they're not being taught in classrooms, or if they don't want to deny it, they'll say, two, you just don't want to have queer representation in the classroom. You don't want to acknowledge the existence of gay kids in the classroom. These are social issues that under the traditional American conception of education, a non-status-based conception of education had no room in the classroom to begin with. But the mind of leftism and the mind of leftist elitist is so captured by status that it's no longer simply an attempt to distinguish themselves, as Rob Henderson points out in his theory, but rather they use status as an attempt to draw moral conclusions which are fraught with the error of being considered on the basis of status. And that, my friends, is the rub with all of this. Yes, it is true that many leftist elitists have this conception of rules for me and not for thee. It is true that Al Gore will preach about the horrors of environmentalist catastrophe, and yet he will go jetting around the world, guzzling gallons upon gallons of oil, polluting the atmosphere in his private jet, and there will be absolutely no consequence. But this is a rather base and a rather elementary observation that should be the beginning of a deeper inquiry into what's going on, and not the beginning and the end of your critique. If you want to up-level your thinking, you're going to have to go beyond your traditional talking points and actually dig into the meat and substance of what you were talking about. The reason it seems hypocritical to you is because within the framework that these people have given in their system of luxury beliefs and their system of the society of status, it actually is not hypocritical to them. They are simply moving the needle forward to fulfill their egalitarian vision of society, which means, in their viewpoint, it's okay to have small trade-offs like complaining about pollution and going ahead and flying on a private jet, because ultimately it's for the greater good. It's for the advancement of their moral vision that happens within the context of status. Status-based political thinking is one of the most destructive, one of the most incoherent, and one of the most anti-American forms of political thinking that currently exists in our country. And we have to look beyond it, not just as a means of self-sorting distinction, but as a means of how they craft policy. I've gone through a few categories right now of how certain classes of activists use the society of status as a tool to advance their policies. But I'll do one more. The activist class. I have not touched on this very much. The activist class. The activist class actually uses status in a way that is quite interesting. They will do a few things. They will first say, we are fighting for the rights of X group here. Whether that group be gay people, whether that group be black people, whether it be women or whatever. And then they will say, they'll add a qualifier to it. X group here is oppressed by the other group. Now, this sounds like oppressor-oppressed dynamic. It's part of that, but it goes a little bit deeper. And they will then not treat the groups in the abstract, but they will treat the groups rather on the basis of status. And they will even treat people that are within the groups on that same basis. If you, for example, are a woman and you're oppressed, according to parts of the activist class, you deserve representation. But if you are a black, trans, disabled woman that is oppressed, you deserve more representation. So status creates a hierarchy, which is interesting because leftists oftentimes say they don't like hierarchy. But status creates this hierarchy, which elevates certain members within the groups that they claim they want to represent above others and then gives them more political and social capital to speak within this worldview over others. And then it elevates the oppressor to a status of the enemy, and no matter what comes from the oppressor's camp, no matter how reasonable their arguments are, you will go through any intellectual length to destroy and diminish and debunk their arguments because it comes from a rotten source according to what you believe. This is why some people will say that assimilation is bad. This is why they'll say that logic itself is colonialist. It's an example of colonializing minds, because they view the entire system, the activist class views the entire system as built on this inherent original sin of oppression, so much so that they will then use status-based thinking to phrase everything that comes from that system. Essentially, status is used as the single and dominant principle by which the activist left evaluates both their enemies and their allies to the detriment of both. Then you'll have the wealthy leftists, the Bill Gates of the world, the Al Gores of the world. And these are a more interesting breed of people. Let's talk about this interesting breed of people. They're very interesting to me. They'll advance the idea of doing good, which is to go in society and try to, in their view, do the most good of those people. And they're willing to do good, even at the expense of ordinary people, which is where Henderson's thesis kind of comes in and kind of affirms it. They're willing, for example, to go against oil and fracking, despite the fact that oil and fracking are some of the greatest sources of energy in parts of America, and they provide the American economy with a lot of jobs, on the name of ensuring that they'll have a cleaner future. Even if that cleaner future, so to speak, is actually more costly to the environment, because that cleaner future is going to involve mining, stripping entire forests of their trees, and mining their ores for batteries to go into these cleaner power sources. Isn't that interesting? But status, okay? Listen to me, guys. The status around being environmentally conscious is almost more important in their eyes than the most evident consequences of this misnomer. I want to be environmentally conscious, but this suggests that the only way to be environmentally conscious is by way of supporting policies that are not only economically disastrous, they're just not sustainable in the long run with the current technology we have right now. So we've seen educational leftism, wealthy leftism, and activist leftism, and how they all use the society of status in a way not only to just benefit from luxury views, but to draw forth moral conclusions in their viewpoint on the basis of status on how they should run society. My friends, American society is a bottom-up endeavor, not a top-down endeavor. And it would do well for all of us as Americans to remember that. Not only would it do well for us to remember that, it would doubly do well for us to reject the philosophies of ideologies that reject our ethos of being a bottom-up society, and most importantly, to reject the sort of norms that form in our politics around those philosophies. If there's a philosophy that tells you that it's better to have a certain position in society, or a certain position in society somehow gives you some clarity about politics or about justice or whatever, you should reject that. Because a position doesn't give you clarity about anything. Sound thinking gives you clarity about something. And sound thinking will be applied to information that can be sorted out and that is intelligible. You don't need to be a wealthy person, you need to be a rich person, a connected person to connect that American tradition, birthright of conscience. You simply have to have a functioning brain between your eyes. And many of you do. Some people don't, but many of you do. And as Americans, that should enlighten you. That should inspire you. The psychology of luxury beliefs is ultimately a bind on human progress. Because when you're more worried about pursuing a claim or a concept or an idea, because it'll endear you to somebody or something, or you think it will at least, I'm here to tell you, your habits are temporary, but the consequences of your actions, they last for a long time. And if you're constantly chasing the approval of people and you're not chasing the truth, your eyes are fixed in the wrong direction. But this is why a lot of Americans are under the delusion that Ivy League universities are the creme de la creme of education, and in order to be a holistically educated person, you have to go to there. This is why Americans are under the delusion, increasingly less so, but still, that only verified information comes from the big cable news channels, nowhere else. This is why a lot of Americans are under the delusion that government sources are inherently credible. This is why Americans are under the delusion that social welfare is a given, and it shouldn't be truly social. It should instead be provided by government. This is why Americans are under the delusion that talking points and sound bites are the best ways to deal with information rather than depth and others. This is why Americans are under the delusion that if someone has a lot of followers, they are somehow a gift from God. They are somehow gratified in their opinions. This is why Americans are under the delusion of so many false conceptions of the world that ultimately bring our republic down. And it would do all of us a favor to reject the society of status, luxury beliefs, and the delusions they carry, lest we as Americans lose the birthright we've been given by our founders. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to get our messages out there. If you like this message or if you enjoy philosophical commentary with a political and social tinge to it, please be sure also to share the video. Be sure to also donate to me if you want to. All that information is in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.